You've had a moment of absolute clarity before, a moment where you looked at your life, your patterns, your results, the relationships that keep repeating themselves with different faces, and thought, now I get it. This time it's going to be different. And then, it wasn't not because you're weak, not because the universe conspired against you, not because you lacked information, motivation, or the right program. It's because there is something inside you that actively does not want you to change, and that something is not small. It is not a bad habit you can replace with a morning routine. It is not a limiting belief that disappears after 3 weeks of affirmations. It is a structure, a deep architecture that was built brick by brick over decades, and that has a very specific function to keep you exactly where you are. That something has a name. It has more than one name, actually. Sigmund Freud spent 40 years studying this phenomenon and called it resistance, not as a metaphor, as a clinical mechanism. He observed, across hundreds of patients, that at the exact moment therapy began to touch the core of the problem, the patient would miss the session, change the subject, become angry at the therapist, or simply forget what they had just realized. The mind wasn't failing. It was defending itself. Carl Jung went further. He said there isn't just resistance. There is an entire structure that inhabits the unconscious, which he called the shadow. Everything you don't want to see in yourself, everything that was repressed, denied, rejected, it doesn't disappear. It stays alive, in the dark, running your behavior from a place you cannot see. And here is the point nobody tells you in manifestation videos. You cannot reprogram what you cannot see. You can repeat affirmations for 90 days. You can visualize with cinematic detail. You can feel genuine gratitude every morning. And still, if the shadow Jung described keeps operating in the basement of your psyche, your results will not change in any sustainable way, because you'll be trying to build a new version of yourself on a foundation that is still running the old code. That is what this episode is about. This is not another video about limiting beliefs. This is not another list of habits to add to your routine. This is a dissection. We are going deep into the structure of resistance, what it is, where it comes from, how it operates in your body and your behavior, and, most importantly, what to do with it without trying to destroy it. Because trying to destroy resistance is the wrong approach, and that distinction is going to change everything. Before we continue, I need to say something that is genuinely important for your journey in this series. If you arrived here without watching the previous episodes, especially the video on manifestation as a trap and the episode on why gratitude alone isn't enough, you are entering the story at the wrong chapter. Not because you won't understand the words, but because every episode in this series was built as a step. And some steps, when skipped, leave the next one with nowhere to land. Go back, watch in sequence. The channel already has the complete map waiting for you. Other thinkers and references we've introduced along the way will make significantly more sense in context, and the depth of what you're about to experience here will multiply. Now, let's go in. Freud discovered something that took decades for the world to accept. The conscious mind is not in charge. It believes it is. It constructs sophisticated narratives to justify what the unconscious has already decided. You do not choose your patterns deliberately. You execute them, and then invent a story about why that made sense. This is not human weakness, it is design. The ego, and here we use the word in its most precise sense, not the popular meaning of arrogance, is the psychic instance that organizes your identity. It is the internal narrator. That says I am this way, I do things this way. This is who I am. And the ego has a fundamental characteristic that both Freud and Jung mapped with precision. It is deeply conservative. It prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar pleasure. Read that again. It prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar pleasure, not because it's masochistic, because the unknown is, to the primitive nervous system, synonymous with danger. And the ego, before it is anything else, is a survival mechanism, Jordan. Peterson puts this in a way that cuts through any intellectual defense. He says the comfort zone is not a comfortable place, it is a familiar place. There is an enormous difference. You can be completely miserable in your current situation and still resist change with everything you have. Because at least the current misery is one you know. You know how to survive it. The new, even if it's better, requires you to learn to survive again. And that demand, at the most primitive level of the nervous system, registers as threat. That's why people know what they need to do and don't do it. It's not lack of knowledge. It is the neurological cost of change being evaluated in real time by your limbic system, and the system saying, not yet. It's not safe yet. Let's hear from Alan Watts on this, because he had a way of saying difficult things that makes you laugh and ache at the same time. Watts said that human beings spend their lives trying to control experience so they are never surprised, and that this attempt at control is precisely what creates the prison. The ego wants to map the future before entering it. And when the future cannot be mapped, when it involves a version of you that doesn't yet exist, the ego simply bars the entrance, not out of malice, by design. The question then is not how to kill the ego. The question is, how do you have a different conversation with it? That is what we are going to build throughout this episode. And if you stay until the end, and there is a very specific reason to do that, you will leave here with a practice you can do tonight before you sleep. A practice that requires no willpower, no discipline, and no belief in anything before you try it. Stay. Imagine you have a car. You believe you're at the wheel. You decide where to go, when to brake, which route to take. But there is a passenger in the back seat you never see, and that passenger, every now and then, pulls the emergency brake without warning. You don't understand why you stopped. The car was running. The tank was full. The GPS was correct. But you stopped. That is what Carl Jung called the shadow operating in your life. The shadow is not the evil inside you. That is the greatest misunderstanding of the Jungian concept. The shadow is everything that was rejected, not because it was bad, but because at some point in your history it was dangerous to exist. It was dangerous to show anger. It was dangerous to be too ambitious. It was dangerous to want more than the people around you had. It was dangerous to stand out. It was dangerous to fail. It was dangerous to succeed when the people you loved were still struggling. And the human psyche, in its brutal survival wisdom, put all of that in the basement, did not throw it away. Put it in the basement. And what stays in the basement does not die. It stays alive, in the dark, growing without supervision, and influencing everything that happens upstairs, without the owner of the house having the faintest idea. Let's go to a concrete example, because philosophical abstractions are beautiful but they don't pay any bills. Marcus is 41 years old. He spent his career building what he described as a series of almost successes. He always got close, always close. A business that grew to a certain point and stopped. A promotion that went to someone else by the slimmest margin. A project that was working and, on the eve of scaling, collapsed from a setback that nobody could have predicted. Marcus didn't have a competence problem. He'd been in therapy for 8 years and knew that. The problem was more subtle, and it took time to surface. Marcus's father had failed publicly. A business that went bankrupt in a humiliating way, debt, reputation gone, colleagues knowing, the whole community watching. Marcus was 11 years old when it happened. What Marcus learned, not through words but through visceral and irrefutable experience, was that visible success was dangerous. Not financially, emotionally, because what goes up can fall, and the fall is witnessed by everyone. Marcus's resistance wasn't fear of failure. It was fear of public failure. And the solution his nervous system had found was elegant in its cruelty. Never reach a high enough point for the fall to be visible. When Marcus finally named that, not in therapy, but in a moment of honest confrontation with himself during a week away from everything, he described the feeling as a knot I didn't know was closed, opening for the first time, It didn't solve everything immediately, but it changed the angle. Because when you know what is operating, you can begin to have a different conversation with it. Freud would call this making the unconscious conscious, the fundamental task of all psychoanalysis. Jung would call it illuminating the shadow. Rogers would call it unconditional self-acceptance as a catalyst for change. Peterson would call it taking responsibility for your own narrative. Watts would call it stopping fighting the river and learning to swim in it. Different languages for the same movement. Rachel had a different story but the same structure. She didn't fear success. She had what is technically called a worthiness ceiling. She grew up in a household where money was scarce and where the scarcity carried a moral charge. Good people didn't have much because good people didn't want much. Accumulating was greed. Charging what you're worth was arrogance. There was a version of Christianity woven into her upbringing where prosperity and virtue existed in tension. A quiet but persistent message that wanting more meant something was wrong with your soul. Rachel had become a therapist, not coincidentally, a profession where you help others prosper while maintaining yourself in a position of service. An unconscious mechanism of almost surgical elegance. When she started charging what her work was actually worth, the first movement that happened was not in the market. It was internal. A voice she recognized, without drama, as her mother's. Who do you think you are? Hélio Couto, from within his quantum perspective on frequencies, would describe Rachel's vibrational field as calibrated below where she consciously wanted to be. Not because she was weak, because the field had been tuned for decades to a specific frequency, and the system resisted any adjustment the way a musical instrument begins to sound different and immediately tries to return to its original tuning. What Rachel did, and this is important, was not try to convince the voice it was wrong. Not try to suppress the voice. It was to recognize it, to genuinely thank it for the protection it had offered in a different context. And then, with that voice still present, make the conscious decision to act differently. Rogers was right, acceptance doesn't paralyze. It releases. There is a third pattern that appears frequently enough to deserve attention here, because it is the most invisible of the three: resistance to the process itself. Edward knew everything. He had read Jung done Dispenza, had Peterson memorized, had attended workshops, retreats, family constellation sessions, CBT, EMDR. He knew more about the map of transformation than most practitioners in the field. And he was still in the same place. Edward's problem was not lack of knowledge. It was that knowledge had become his comfort zone. Learning about transformation had replaced the act of transforming. The resistance, in Edward's case, had found an extremely sophisticated way of disguising itself as progress. Watts would have recognized Edward immediately, and would probably have laughed with warmth. Because Watts said that the ego's greatest trick is turning the search for liberation into a new form of prison. You can spend years studying the path without taking a single step. Resistance is not dumb. It is adaptive. It learns. It evolves alongside you. And as you become more sophisticated, it becomes more sophisticated. What does this mean for you? It means the criterion of evaluation is not how much you know. It is what has actually changed in your real life. Your real bank account, your real relationships, your real body. Peterson is direct about this to the point of being uncomfortable. You can use psychology to understand yourself, or you can use it to justify yourself. The difference between those two applications is not in the knowledge. It is in the honesty with which you look at the actual results of your life. Before we get to the exercise for this chapter, an observation that may be the most important moment of this video for some people. If you recognized yourself in any of those three stories, if you felt that specific, tightening in the chest that isn't quite sadness and isn't quite anger, but is somehow both at the same time, that is not coincidence. That is your nervous system recognizing something your conscious mind hasn't fully named yet, and naming it is. The first act of power. Simple exercise, the shadow map. This exercise is done by hand, with paper and pen. not on your phone. Physical writing activates different neural circuits than typing. This is not mysticism. It is the neuroscience of fine motor movement associated with episodic memory. Divide a sheet into 2 columns. In the left column, write 3 behaviors of yours that you cannot rationally explain. Not the worst you've ever had, the most persistent, the ones that show up repeatedly even when you don't want them to. They can be related to money, relationships, work, or your own body. Write without censoring. In the right column, next to each behavior, write the question, what is this behavior protecting? Don't answer yet. Just leave the question on the paper. Then, below both columns, write this sentence in full. I am not sabotaging myself. I am being loyal to a system I once needed to survive. And I now have permission to learn a new one. Read it out loud. Once, this doesn't resolve anything in 30 seconds. But it plants something. And what we plant with awareness has a chance of growing differently than what grew in the dark. Let's step into the lab now. Because everything that Jung and Freud described in clinical and philosophical language, modern neuroscience spent the last several decades confirming with MRI scanners, electroencephalograms, and neuroplasticity studies that would fundamentally change how we understand human behavior. And the most unsettling data point that emerged from these studies is this: your brain consumes less energy maintaining an old pattern than creating a new one. Not a metaphor, metabolism. Joe Dispenza has dedicated decades to translating advanced neuroscience into accessible language, and his work with meditation, brain reprogramming, and the study of spontaneous healing cases led him to a very precise understanding of what happens in the nervous system when we try to change. He explains that every thought you think and every emotion you feel is, at the neurological level, a network of neurons firing together. The more times that pattern fires, the stronger the connection becomes. Neurons that fire together wire together. That is the Hebbian principle at the foundation of all neuroplasticity. Here is the problem. The neural networks associated with your oldest patterns are the most robust in your system. They are 8-lane highways built over decades. And the new version of you trying to emerge is attempting to create a dirt path through a dense forest. The brain, when confronted with the choice between the highway and the dirt path, chooses the highway every time. Not out of stupidity, out of energetic efficiency. Dispenza went further and described something he calls emotional addiction, a concept that, when you truly understand it, completely redefines the question of self-sabotage. He observed that the human body produces chemical substances corresponding to each emotional state: adrenaline for fear, dopamine for anticipation, cortisol for stress, and that the body, after years of being repeatedly bathed in certain chemical combinations, develops a kind of tolerance and dependency to them, exactly as occurs with external substances. What does this mean in practice? It means that if you have spent years in a state of financial anxiety, your body literally learned to function with that chemistry. And when the situation begins to change, when the threat begins to diminish, the body doesn't feel relief. It feels deprivation. And then, without your conscious awareness, it begins creating situations that restore the familiar chemical level. You are not attracting problems. You are in withdrawal. That is uncomfortable to hear. And it is completely consistent with what Freud described as the compulsion to repeat, the phenomenon by which people inexplicably recreate the same painful situations throughout their lives, with different characters but the same script. Alan Watts had an image for this that is simultaneously precise and quietly funny, as was his way. He said that trying to stop an emotional pattern through willpower is like trying to stop the ocean with your hands. It is not that the ocean is malevolent. It is that you are using the wrong instrument for the wrong problem. Jordan Peterson adds a layer that the world of spirituality frequently avoids because it is uncomfortable: responsibility. He says there is a difference between understanding why you are the way you are, which is legitimate and necessary, and using that understanding as a license to keep being that way indefinitely. The past explains. It doesn't justify forever. The moment you have awareness of the mechanism is the moment responsibility begins. And neuroscience confirms Peterson. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for conscious decision-making, planning, and moderation of emotional responses, has genuine capacity to begin remodeling the neural networks of the limbic system. Not instantly, not with a single visualization, but with repeated, intentional, and crucially, emotionally charged practice. That last part is where most reprogramming protocols fail. Dispenza insists on this. You do not reprogram the brain with thoughts. You reprogram it with states. With the combination of thought plus emotion plus body sensation, experienced with sufficient intensity and sufficient repetition for the nervous system to begin treating the new pattern as familiar. That is why visualization without real emotional presence doesn't move the needle. You can imagine the outcome, but if the body didn't feel it, if it was an intellectual exercise without somatic resonance, the limbic system registered nothing new. It registered just another thought passing through the stream of consciousness. Hélio Couto described this process in terms of coherence between the mental field and the emotional field. He said that incoherence, wanting one thing with the mind and feeling another with the body, doesn't just block manifestation. It actively reverses it. The stronger field wins. And the emotional field, rooted in decades of somatic experience, is almost always stronger than a few months of mental intention. So what do? We are not going to leave that question hanging. But before we get to the complete protocol, which comes in Chapter 5 and was built specifically to work with resistance in a neuroscientifically informed way, I need you to understand a distinction that will determine whether what you're about to learn actually works or becomes one more tool you tried and eventually abandoned. The distinction is this: there is a difference between processing resistance and fighting it. Processing means making contact, recognizing, naming, feeling where it lives in the body, because it lives somewhere specific, always. Fighting means trying to overpower, trying to be stronger, trying to push the backseat passenger out of the car while driving. All depth psychology, from Freud to Jung to Rogers, points in the same direction. What you process, you integrate. What you fight, you amplify. This is not vague Eastern philosophy. It is what happens in the nervous system when you activate the sympathetic nervous system in an attempt to suppress an emotional state. The system interprets the suppression as additional threat and increases the response. You become more anxious trying not to be anxious, more irritated trying not to get irritated, more afraid trying not to feel fear. The counterintuitive exit, which Carl Rogers demonstrated clinically over decades, is permission. Not permission to behave any way you want. Permission to feel what is real, without trying to transform it before recognizing it. That is what the next chapter's exercise will build. And if you've made it this far, and very few people make it this far in any video, you are already in a different position than most. Not because you learned something new, because you started looking at something that was there all along. If this episode is touching something you didn't know you needed to hear, share it with someone you know needs it. Not as advice, as presence. That's the most quantum gesture there is, and Hélio Couto would say you already know that. The next chapter is about real people, real patterns, and the exact moment resistance gives way, not because it was defeated, but because it was finally understood. There is a specific moment in the journey of anyone who works with deep transformation. It is not when they learn the right concept. It is not when they do the perfect exercise. It is when they are able to look at the pattern that was limiting them and say, without anger and without pity, I understand where you came from. That moment has a name in Jungian psychology: shadow integration, and it is not abstract. It happens with real people, in very specific moments of their lives. Marcus was 41 and had a professional history. He described himself as a series of almost successes, He always got close. A business that grew to a certain point and stopped. A promotion that went to someone else by the narrowest margin. A project that was working and, on the eve of scaling, unraveled from a setback that nobody could have predicted. Marcus didn't have a competence problem. He'd been in therapy for 8 years and knew that. The problem was subtler, and it took time to surface. His father had failed publicly. A business that went bankrupt in humiliating fashion. Debt, reputation in ruins, colleagues and neighbors watching. Marcus was 11 when it happened. What Marcus learned, not through words but through visceral and irrefutable experience, was that visible success was dangerous. Not financially, emotionally. Because what goes up can fall, and the fall is seen by everyone. Marcus's resistance wasn't fear of failure. It was fear of public failure. And the solution his nervous system had found was elegant in its cruelty. Never reach a high enough point for the fall to be visible. When Marcus finally named that, not in therapy, but in a moment of honest confrontation with himself during a week away from everything, he described the sensation as a knot I didn't know was closed, opening for the first time. It didn't resolve everything immediately, but it changed the angle. Because when you know what is operating, you can begin to have a different conversation with it. Freud would call this making the unconscious conscious, the fundamental task of all psychoanalysis. Jung would call it illuminating the shadow. Rogers would call it unconditional self-acceptance as a catalyst for change. Peterson would call it taking responsibility for your own narrative. Watts would call it stopping fighting the river and learning to swim in it. Different languages for the same movement. Rachel had a different story but the same structure. She didn't fear success. She had what is technically called a worthiness ceiling. She grew up in a household where money was scarce and where the scarcity carried a moral weight. Good people didn't have much because good people didn't want much. There was a version of faith woven into her upbringing, a quiet but persistent message that wanting more meant something was spiritually wrong with you. Accumulating was greed. Charging what you're worth was arrogance. Rachel became a therapist, not coincidentally, a profession where you help others prosper while maintaining yourself in a position of service. An unconscious mechanism of almost surgical elegance. When she started charging what her work was actually worth, raising her rate from $90 to $175 per session, the first movement that happened was not in the market. It was internal. A voice she recognized, without drama, as her mother's. Who do you think you are? Hélio Couto, from within his quantum perspective on frequencies, would describe Rachel's vibrational field as calibrated below where she consciously wanted to be. Not because she was weak. Because the field had been tuned for decades to a specific frequency. And the system resisted any adjustment the way a musical instrument that begins to sound different immediately tries to return to its original tuning. What Rachel did, and this matters, was not try to convince the voice it was wrong. Not try to suppress the voice. It was to recognize it, to genuinely acknowledge the protection it had offered in a different context. And then, with that voice still present, make the conscious decision to act differently. Rogers was right. Acceptance doesn't paralyze, it releases. There is a third pattern that appears frequently enough to deserve attention here. Because it is the most invisible of the three, resistance to the process itself. Edward knew everything. He had read Jung, done Dispenza workshops, had Peterson's lectures memorized. He'd attended retreats, done family constellation work, CBT, EMDR, breathwork intensives. He knew more about the map of transformation than most practitioners in the field. And he was still in the same place. Edward's problem was not lack of knowledge. It was that knowledge had become his comfort zone. Learning about transformation had replaced the act of transforming. The resistance, in Edward's case, had found an extremely sophisticated way of disguising itself as progress. Every new book was a reason to wait. Every new framework was preparation for eventually starting. The intellectual scaffolding was impeccable. The building never went up. Watts would have recognized Edward immediately and would probably have smiled with that particular warmth he had. Because Watts said the ego's greatest trick is turning the search for liberation into a new form of prison. You can spend years studying the path without taking a single step. Resistance is not dumb. It is adaptive. It learns. It evolves alongside you. And as you become more sophisticated, it becomes more sophisticated. What does this mean for you? It means the criterion of evaluation is not how much you know. It is what has actually changed in your real life. Your real bank account, your real relationships, your real body. Peterson is direct about this to the point of being uncomfortable. You can use psychology to understand yourself, or you can use it to justify yourself. The difference between those two applications is not in the knowledge. It is in the honesty with which you look at the actual results of your life. All three, Marcus, Rachel, Edward, had a turning point, and in none of the three cases was it a new insight. It was a moment of stopping the negotiation with resistance and naming it with enough precision that it lost the ability to operate in the dark. Because the shadow, as Jung insisted, doesn't need to be destroyed, it needs to be seen. And what is seen, with enough honesty and enough compassion, doesn't disappear, but stops driving. We have arrived at the chapter that determines whether this episode will be another hour well spent or an actual turning point. And I'm going to be direct about what separates the two. A real turning point requires you to do something tonight, not tomorrow. Not when you have more time, more energy, more clarity. Tonight, before you sleep. The nervous system has a window of elevated plasticity in the moments before sleep. This is not spirituality. It is basic chronobiology, the hypnagogic state that precedes sleep, when the brain begins to decelerate from beta waves to alpha and theta, is the same state in which the subconscious system is most receptive to new information. Hypnotherapists have known this for more than a century. Sleep neuroscience has confirmed it over the past 20 years. It is in that window that this chapter's exercise will happen. But before the exercise, the complete integration protocol, which is different from anything you've probably done before, because it is not about adding, it is about recognizing. The Shadow Dialogue Protocol, 7 days. This protocol was built on 4 pillars: Freud's naming, Jung's integration, Rogers's acceptance, and Dispenza's neuroscientific foundation. It is a practice, not a ritual. It requires no prior belief. It requires only willingness for honesty. Days 1 and 2, mapping for 2 days. You are only going to observe, not change anything, not correct anything. Simply notice, with precision and without judgment, the moments when you feel internal resistance. Resistance to starting something, to finishing something, to charging, to receiving, to asking for help, to standing out, to showing up. Every time you notice, you write 1 short sentence, on paper or in a dedicated notebook, not on your phone. The sentence follows this format. I felt resistance when situation. In my body, I felt it as physical location. Chest, throat, stomach, shoulders. The physical location is not optional. Not because it's symbolic, but because the process of naming the somatic sensation begins to activate the prefrontal cortex over the material of the limbic system, which is precisely the neurological movement that Dispenza describes as the beginning of real reprogramming. Days 3 and 4, origin with the map from the first 2 days in front of you. Take each identified resistance and ask one single question. When was the first time I learned that this was dangerous? You don't need a definitive answer. Sometimes the origin is clear, sometimes it isn't, and that's fine. The question already does the work of directing attention downward, toward the roots, instead of outward, toward the symptoms. If a memory surfaces, even fragmented, even uncertain, write it down, not to analyze, to externalize. The act of taking something out of the nervous system and placing it on paper creates cognitive distance. You begin to see the pattern instead of being the pattern. Jung called this objectification of the shadow, the process of giving form and substance to something that was operating as diffuse fog. Days 5 and 6. Dialogue. This is the step most people skip because it feels strange. Don't skip it. You are going to write a letter, not to a person. To the resistance, not as a mystical entity, as a part of you, as the voice from the back seat. The letter begins with recognition. I understand you appeared to protect me. I understand where you came from. I know there was a reason, then an honest acknowledgement that the context has changed. But the danger you were protecting me from is no longer the same. And the protection that worked back then is now costing me what I want most. And it ends with a proposition, not a command. I don't need you to disappear. I need you to occupy a different place. To come with me without driving. This sounds too therapeutic to be practical. That is precisely why it works. You are activating the medial prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for emotional regulation and self-narrative, over material that normally lives below the threshold of language. Language is power over the unconscious. Freud knew this, neuroscience confirmed it. Day 7. Integration. On the 7th day, you reread everything you wrote in the 6 previous days, not to edit, to witness. And then you do the anchor exercise, the one that ties the entire protocol together. The anchor exercise, the mirror of resistance. To be done before sleep, you will need a mirror, any size, and 5 minutes without interruption. Sit or stand in front of the mirror. Look into your own eyes. Not at your appearance, into your eyes. Breathe deeply 3 times, slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, not to relax. To signal to the nervous system that there is no present threat. This reduces cortisol and opens the receptivity window we mentioned. Then, over the next 3 to 4 minutes, hold your gaze and move through 3 questions in sequence. You don't need to answer them out loud, but you need to feel them in the body while looking at yourself. First question: who is actually here, beyond everything I learned to be in order to survive? Second question: what has this resistance been protecting, and can I find some gratitude for that? Third question: what do I consciously choose to do differently from this point forward, even with this part of me still present? After the 3 questions, you say out loud, not to the mirror, to yourself, I integrate what I was to become what I choose. I carry the story without being driven by it. I am more than the patterns I inherited, once out loud, with your gaze fixed on yourself. This exercise activates something no mechanically recited affirmation activates: witnessing presence. You are not just saying words. You are saying words while looking at the person saying them. This creates a feedback loop that the nervous system processes in a completely different way from words spoken at the ceiling at 6 in the morning. Dispenza would say you are beginning to install a new neurological identity, not overwriting the old one, but creating a new parallel network that, with repetition, will progressively become more dominant. Hélio Couto would say you are adjusting the frequency of the field, not with force, with precision. Do this tonight. Tonight, not when it feels like the right moment. The right moment is a promise resistance, makes to ensure you never begin. Now, a word about where this journey is going. You have done something today that most people never do. You look directly at the mechanism that most operates in their lives without their awareness. But this episode was a diagnosis, not a complete treatment. It was the illumination of the basement, not the reconstruction of the house. The next episode in this series will take you somewhere that is, in many ways, even deeper. Because after you see the ego's resistance, the question that naturally emerges is, where did the original programming come from? Why did you learn what you learned? Why did your family operate the way it did? And the answer takes you into territory that science only began exploring formally in the last decade. The invisible loyalties that connect us to patterns of people we never even met. The next episode is called The Hidden Loyalty That Keeps You Small, and it will complete the picture we began building here. Don't jump ahead before doing tonight's exercise. The sequence matters. The step you just climbed needs to be solid before the next one. Closing mantra for the next 7 days. After finishing the mirror exercise, close with this mantra. Say it out loud, slowly, one single time. I am not my patterns. I am the consciousness that observes them. I integrate what was to build what I choose. The resistance I feel is proof that I am growing. And growing, now, is safe. You don't need to fully believe the words. Yet consistent repetition, with real presence, begins to create the belief. Dispenza would explain the mechanism. Jung would approve the process. Rogers would smile. Watts would say you finally stopped fighting the ocean. And Freud, with his characteristic clinical precision, would say what he said to hundreds of patients over 40 years of practice, that making the unconscious conscious is not the end of suffering. It is the beginning of choice. And choice, the real capacity to act differently from what the patterns prescribe, is the most precise form of freedom a human being can experience. You made it here. That was not by accident. It never is. The person who starts a video about the ego's resistance and arrives at the end is someone who is already, at some level, their conscious mind hasn't fully named yet, ready for the next step. I am the quantum architect, and you didn't find your way here by accident.